We're back officially recording now, and again, we'll be posting this up next week. The NTC met and worked through a lot of the different sessions that we're listening to here on the summit. And one we thought would be interesting would be talking about basically how we handle mistakes we make. We all do make them out there in the field, and some are small and some are big and some are private and some are public. But sort of how do we self-assess that, and then how do we become better officials? And I think the three presenters we've got, Noreen, I'm trying not to steal your thunder here. I'll let you go through the proper intro, but just want to add my 2 cents. The three officials you're seeing, Noreen Landis-Tyson, Andy Mccord, and Justin Evans, are all international commissaires in different disciplines. Noreen is the chief official, president of the commissary panel for the track events at Tokyo Olympics this year. Supposed to be last year, but we know what happened there. So Andy's worked multiple world championships and international commissaire in road and track, and was mountain bike until they made him specialized. And Justin is one of the youngest international commissaires that the UCI has seen. So my point before I hand it over is, if they've made mistakes and they're where they are, we're probably going to be okay. It's just how you handle them. So with that said, Noreen, I will hand it over to you and let you take it over.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, so before we get started with the folks on the panel, I would like to challenge each one of you to think about the biggest officiating mistake you've ever made. Because as Chuck said, we have all made them. And think about how you handle that mistake. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today, is how do you identify whether or not you've made a mistake, and how do you, and then how do you handle those mistakes? But first, you get to hear all of us be vulnerable about the mistakes that we've made. We were going to do 90-second introductions, but I've just changed that up a little bit because Chuck did steal my thunder. So we are starting with Andy. And by the way, we do expect to have each one of us talk for about 10 minutes about how we handle mistakes, or how we have handled mistakes in the past, and then open it up to questions, which I hope you will put in the chat, and then we'll go through there and kind of comment or ask for more clarification from you. So we're going to get started with Andy Mccord, and I'm going to embarrass him by saying that Andy and I have worked together, particularly on the track, for a really, 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 really long time. And we both became international commissaires in 1997, along with Randy Shafer and Phil Miller at a class in Ottawa. And I have grown up in my officiating career with Andy. I'll let him decide whether or not he wants to comment on that relative to me. But one of the most respected officials, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Andy as an official. So Andy, take it away.
You're on mute, Andy.
Unmute, buddy. Andy, unmute. Thank you.
Hi, guys. Technically, I'm a little challenged here. Good morning, good afternoon, and to wherever you happen to be. Yes, Noreen, we've been doing this for a long time. I think I started in 1987, and my first race, I believe, was with you in a criterium near the Velodrome, if I remember right. And I won't embarrass you, but something happened that day that I still remember. So, not officiating wise, but otherwise. So, but I'm going to talk about two different events, or two different mistakes that I was involved with, or however you want to put it. But first, I want to let you know I became a mountain bike international commissaire in 1993, and basically the first World Championship was held in Durango in 1990, and I was part of the class that became a national commissaire and was honored to work that. And then a couple of years later, I was able to move up to international commissaire. And so that was 93. In 94, they made me secretary of the Worlds in Vail. And then in 95, they made me president of the commissaires for the World Championships in Kirzarten, Germany, in basically the Black Forest area of Germany. So I was president at that, and in that event, there were actually a number of things that happened. But one of them I consider a pretty good learning experience for me. Something that, falls back. It was a mistake on my part. As president, whatever happens pretty much falls on you. And that's kind of the case here. So to give you a little background with mountain biking, the event that I'm going to talk about is downhill. And basically downhill, for those of you who may not know, is effectively a time trial. It's equivalent to a time trial on mountain bike. It's basically a downhill race, or it starts above, finishes below. At the World Championships, they actually had three different races for different events. And one of them was a qualification race, or the first race they had was a qualification race. And in the downhill race, the only qualification race we had to have was for the elite men, who happened to have somewhere around 100 riders entered, and I think they're only allowing 67 riders into the final. So after the qualification race, once that was narrowed down, then we had to have seeding runs for all the different categories: the elite men, elite women, the junior men, junior women, veteran men, veteran women, so on. There were a fair number of categories in those days. In fact, I think there were over 500 riders, if I remember correctly. But we had a seeding run, and that seeding run was scheduled for Thursday. The final was scheduled for Saturday. And it had been raining all day Wednesday and rained into Saturday, or into Thursday, excuse me, the training runs. And we'd already had a run with the qualification run, so we felt fairly good about it. But I didn't, unbeknownst to me, and that's something I should have checked upon, is that the timing company was Microfunk out of Germany, changed their starting procedures for the seeding run. And I was unaware of that. The course was in terrible shape. Everybody came down. They were completely covered in mud. The front plates, which are the number plates in mountain bike, were completely covered. And the officials and the timing company could not read those numbers. So they could not figure out the times for these people. So we had to go out there and wipe off the numbers and all this. And I think we had 5 or 6 people trying to do that and trying to keep up with it. But between that issue with the mud, which we dealt with it as best we could, but me not knowing exactly what the timing company was doing at the top, basically the results were wrong. They were posted without really, well, with our knowledge, but without us knowing they were really wrong. The next day, Friday, of course, we heard about it. And at Mountain Bike World Championships, they actually hold a manager's meeting nightly. So we're now on Friday, so that Friday night meeting, I had to go in front of the team managers and explain what had happened with the results of the seeding run. And I actually have with me, I have my notes from that. I was able to dig it up. I'll just read you what I have on here. That I basically went into the meeting and I told the team managers directly, we know the results are not perfect. We know what happened on Thursday can't happen tomorrow, which is the finals. We will take all precautions to make it correct. I said, I could explain what happened, but that's going to sound like an excuse, so I'm not going to. And then I opened it up for questions. I said, if you have any questions at all about this, feel free to ask now, because now's the time to do it. And it stood silent for over a minute. No one asked a question. And basically, the point of this to me is the fact that I explained to them that it was my fault, that we were wrong, and that we would fix it. In fact, we came out with, we actually, by that time of that manager meeting, we'd already reposted revised results because we spent all day dealing with it, and came out with the results. We felt that those results were the best we could get. We knew they were still going to be issues in it, but luckily, for my sake, it was a seeding run, which basically is established the order in which the riders would run the next day. It wasn't the finals. If this had happened in the finals, it would have been a disaster. But so my biggest takeaway from that is that we basically apologized, and the managers and team riders took that as a good faith effort, and I think that's probably the moral of my little story here. So I'll move to the second one, and most of you are probably aware of the second mistake that I'm going to talk about, and that was the 2019 Tour of California. And in 2019, I was on the College of Commissaires with the president from the out of country. I won't name who these people are. Many of you probably know who they are, but I'm not going to name them. But the other two are from out of the country, and I was the third one. In that, and I believe, and I'm going off of memory here, but I believe it was stage 4. TJ Vandergarden was the general classification leader in yellow at the time. As we came into the finish, and it was going to be a sprint finish, or it appeared it was going to be a sprint finish, TJ ended up crashing just outside the 3K mark, just outside the 3K or the 3 kilometer mark. And the rules are basically, if you're inside the 3K, that person would get the time of the group they were with. Afterwards, the college got together, and I believe we pulled in organizers and other people that we needed to discuss on this. And we decided that, yes, we should apply that 3K rule to this incident. And realistically, after the fact, after looking at it, and I will say, I want to say that out of the 3 of us in the jury, it was not unanimous. I did vote for basically for applying the 3K rule, but one of the members of the jury did not like that and didn't think that was the right thing. After we did that, it was pretty obvious that we had made a bad mistake. In fact, we got a text or an email, or actually the president did, from the UCI, basically indicating that we needed to change the results. Actually, we didn't get that email and that text until after we'd already started the race to the next stage, and really couldn't do it. But the bottom line is that we made a mistake. We should not have applied the 3K rule in that case for TJ Vandergarden, and it's something that still haunts me today. It's something I think about, and I guarantee if it was the same situation was to happen again, well, I say I guarantee you, I do not believe it'd be about a 99% chance that it would not be applied. I always think there's potentially other reasons you might change your mind, but so those are my two mistakes that I just wanted to bring up here and go through. I know that Noreen also wanted to kind of talk about how do we deal with self-evaluation, that kind of thing, and these different incidents. And one of the things that I used to do, and I don't do it now, but I used to when I started my officiating career, I kept a journal. And I wrote down after every race things that happened in this race. And it allowed me to be frank with myself. I could put down on paper because no one else was going to see it. So, and in fact, when I was flipping back through that journal in the last few days, the last couple of weeks, just looking at things, and it's surprising some of the things that I wrote about different people and different incidences and things like that. But it allowed me to be honest with myself and make a good self-evaluation of my performance. I kind of think of it as a sense of, I don't know if any of you guys have read the Bill Russell autobiography, the basketball Hall of Famer Bill Russell. And basically, I think he said he evaluated himself after every game, and I don't think he gave himself over a 70%. I probably, hopefully, I give myself a little more than a 70%, but you can't be 100%. If you're 100%, you're lying to yourself on any type of officiating that you do. So with that, Noreen,
Yep, that's great. Thank you. And as I said, we'll all be available for any questions or comments you have after we're all done our presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin now and let him give you some context for his examples and how he evaluates his performance.
Yeah, so hey everybody, as most of you guys know, I do work with Chuck at the office as Chuck's right-hand minion, but I got my start in cycling as a Boy Scout, just doing some local rides around the grass fields of North Carolina, and my local club decided they were hosting an Omnium year on year, and their officials' costs were too high. So at the ripe age of 16, I attended my first officials course with Judy Ryan, who I believe is on here, and she taught my first course, and from there it was just a passion that I had. I would go to some races while actually racing and sit up on stage with Judy, score 1 or 2 races to offset the cost of my official, or work for free, but I didn't have to pay an entry fee. So that was the first few years of my officials career / ending of my bike racing career. I realized I could go a lot further officiating than I could being an athlete. And as we can all see, that's definitely been the case. But I became an international, as Chuck said, at 20, I think right at 25, which is the minimum age you can be. So at the time I was the youngest in the world. There may be somebody younger than me now that I'm approaching 30. I'm getting old here. But as we were, Noreen, Andy, and I sat down last week and went over this panel, and we wanted to all talk about what we were going to discuss. And I actually really struggled. I had a very hard time finding something that was worth talking about. Noreen and Andy both have 30 plus years of officiating experience, and obviously that's older than I am. And not to make anybody feel old, but it was a struggle of just finding what I felt as a mistake and how I could present it to you guys, and it not just be making something up that wasn't valuable or genuine. So I'll preface this by saying my mistake fortunately had no outcome on the race, but it had a big outcome in terms of how I've officiated moving forward. And this comes back from my first event as a chief referee for a road race with no caravan or anything, but we were struggling to have motor refs in the area. So all of our fields on course had follow vehicles with a official in the car. And I, as chief referee, just assumed I knew what I was doing and showed up the morning of the race with my officials that were going to be in the car, with the police, with the course marshals, and just assumed that everybody knew what was going on. Everybody had done it before, and I didn't need to have a conversation with anybody. Just, you guys are all older than me. I think I was 18. You guys are all older. You've been here. You know what's going on. You don't need to hear what's going on from an 18-year-old. So we set out on the race, and lo and behold, on our field, we have a breakaway of, I think it was 4 or 5 riders that had gone up the road. And my official in the car radios and says, hey, I'm having a struggle with the lead police vehicle. He does not want to go in front of our breakaway. He wants to stay in front of the field. He thought it was a safety issue by not protecting the larger group of people. So obviously, as we all know, the police car is supposed to protect the entire race, whether it be out in front of the breakaway or just in front of the field if there is no break. So ultimately, this all comes down to not just assuming and not having those pre-race preparations that you need to have conversations, regardless of whether it's an official who's been doing this for 30 years or a cop who's shown up for his first race as a lead vehicle. You can't ever assume that everybody that you're working with knows what's going on, even if it's not their first time. So, as I said, it fortunately didn't have any negative outcomes. The group knew where they were going because it didn't go out on the first lap. So the breakaway knew the directions of the course, and obviously at the end of the day, it's their responsibility. But as you can imagine from the rider's perspective, it definitely looked a little interesting when they pass a police car and the police car just sits there and lets the brake go up the road and the car sits in front. So the little bit more interesting piece of the story is getting a call over the radio by the police officer who threatened to arrest the chief referee and the person in charge and the official for not following the directions of a police officer there. So that definitely made it a little interesting, but boy, have I learned that you can't just assume, and you need to have these conversations regardless of how well informed you think people might be. Throughout the rest of my officiating career, I've had weird stories. I've seen people make other decisions that I didn't necessarily agree with, but I've never really experienced a true mistake where I've been able to stand in front of somebody and say, I screwed up, I made a mistake, and we're going to have to deal with it. Fortunately, I have not, but I know that's coming. As long as I stay an official, I know I'm human, I'm going to make a mistake, and I am the person who will gladly stand in front of somebody and say I've made a mistake, and it's okay. It's okay as long as you learn from it and be okay with making that mistake, and just make sure it doesn't then happen again. And the other point of this with how we self-reflect, as I mentioned, Judy Ryan was the lady who taught my first officials course. So between Judy, Michael Donovan, who I don't believe is on today, and Michael Droulet, who is international out of Canada, the three of them are my kind of hearing panel that I spend a lot of time with post-event, just kind of talking through things and saying, hey, this was kind of weird. This is what happened. Have you seen this before? Have you experienced it? And what would you have done? And some of those weird scenarios are definitely the best learning experiences. And a mistake is okay as long as you learn from it. A mistake is okay, especially if it's somebody else's mistake that you don't then make yourself. So that's about what I have. I obviously know I didn't have my 2 stories, and we'll leave Noreen's stories. She's got some good ones, so we'll leave them to her.
Thanks, Justin. One of the things that I would really like people to take away from this, particularly those who are early in your career, that you can make a mistake and still survive. And so I'm going to tell you about a big mistake that I made when I was just a young track official, if you will. So Our track was actually built here in Colorado Springs in 1983. And we did have the opportunity to have some officials come out from Trexlertown to work the Olympic trials alongside us, who knew nothing about a track except that it was oval, and our track was, of course, 333 meters. And that's really all we knew. And luckily, we had some great, very experienced people who came out. And so we gained some experience out of that. And a couple of years later, well, in 84, 85, 86 timeframe, bicycling Grand Prix were happening across the country at tracks. And there was, it was a very well-funded event. There were huge prize lists relative to what had been offered before. And because we had very few people in Colorado who knew anything about track, we were put in positions, or allowed ourselves to be put in positions that maybe we weren't, I'll speak for myself, I wasn't qualified for. And so one of these bicycling Grand Prix, we had a points race that was going on. And again, a lot of money on the line, and very experienced track officials that, track riders that knew more about what was going on the track than I did as the combined chief referee starter for that event. And long story short, it started to rain. We were past the 2/3 mark. So whatever would have happened would have been the final in that particular race. And a lot of the riders that were riding in Colorado Springs really had not ridden there before, at least not much. And we're not really sure how slick the track was, how slick the paint was, or anything of that sort. Long story short, again, I let that race go too long. And what was happening prior to it starting to rain was that Mike McCarthy was blowing away the competition on points. And at that point, it was laps over, distance over points. And so he was blowing them away on points. And so it started to rain, and a lot of the fields started to sit up because they were concerned. And Harvey Nitz decided that he had found heaven, and that he was going to like blow through the field. And for the 2 laps that I let it go too long, he took a lap. And in that case, won the bike race, at least on paper. And so, you know, obviously I finally stopped the race, and you could immediately see the, well, what are you going to do there, Noreen? And so I got McCarthy and Nitz and anybody else who wanted to come and join the conversation into one of the rooms at the Velodrome. And I just basically said, I screwed up. You know, I screwed up. Somebody won this bike race technically that wouldn't have run the bike race if I had stopped it when I should have. And so I'm telling you that that's the case. I'm not going to legislate what should happen here, but the 2 of you can now work it out. And Mike McCarthy looked at me and said, I've never had an official tell me that they blew it. And this was very early in my career with officials with riders who I was just building my reputation with. And so the fact that I was willing to stand there and say, you know what, I screwed this up. And I wish you guys would work it out amongst yourselves. But, you know, if you ask me what has to happen, if you ask me what has to happen, I'm going to tell you that we've got to give the prize to Nitz because he won the bike race. But you guys can figure out what you want to do. I know I earned a lot of blue sky that day. But you can tell many, many years later, I have never forgotten that mistake because it was a biggie for me. It was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did this, but I did. And guess what? That was 86, 87, somewhere in there. And today I'm an international commissaire on the track and assigned to the Olympic Games. So you can survive mistakes that other people may remember and talk about and still, move up in your career. I think the other one for me is, I need some context around this. So women have not in the UCI up until a couple of years ago been appointed as a starter at a World Cup or a World Championship. I don't think it was anything that was necessarily intentional. It was just the culture. And so I had the distinct honor of being appointed as the starter, the very first female starter at a World Cup in 2-3 years ago in Milton. And so there I was, feeling the weight of the female world on my shoulders, trying to do the best I could. And everybody, when a starter makes a mistake, everybody sees it. And of course, when you make a mistake on a track event, everybody sees it anyway. And I was running a tempo race as a part of the International Omnium. And for those of you who don't know what a tempo race is, the leader on the track gets a point on every lap, and then points take the person with the most number of points wins the tempo race, basically. And so tempo races typically in an omnium break up all over the place because there's so many different levels of skill, basically, of riders who are riding an omnium. And this was no exception. It was breaking up all over the place. So we had people losing laps, we had people gaining laps. And of course, you have to be clear as to who the leader on the track is at any given time, because that person is getting a point. And I missed a rider. We had 4 or 5 riders who took a lap, and I missed a rider who was off the front of the field and was pointing instead to the field in terms of the folks who were getting points. And at the end of the race, it was a Swiss rider. The Swiss coach came over and said, what happened to my rider? You missed my rider for 2 laps here. And I said, no, I didn't miss your rider. I'm sure I didn't miss your rider. And so of course, he drags over his handy dandy laptop and because they have recorded the race, and he shows me that I missed his rider. And I was not the president of the panel. And so I looked at this and I went, yeah, I missed your rider for 2 laps. I screwed that up. And so I said to the president of the panel, what do you want to do about that? I mean, it's your decision as to what you want to do. And he pulled me aside and he said, yeah, but I want your input. And so I said, you know what, in my opinion, we should fix it because we know it's wrong and it will move this rider up 1 place. Now, of course, with that, it moves somebody else down 1 place. But it was the right thing to do because it was my screw up. And so I can tell you that the judges were not terribly happy because they had to go back and figure out who got points that shouldn't have, et cetera. But we fixed it. And I can also tell you that the Swiss coach looked at me and said, that's not what I expected was going to happen. And so we did have another commissaire and a longstanding international commissaire on the back straight that in a post event meeting, he said, I wouldn't have done that. I would have left it the way it was because we make mistakes. And in my opinion, riders ride based on, and coaches coach based on what the score that's up on the scoreboard, et cetera, et cetera. And now to all of a sudden change that after the race was over, I don't think was the right thing to do. However, absolutely nobody came over and complained about the fact that we changed it because they knew it was wrong. So, so those are, you know, that is just something that I have learned over time in that I think it is okay. I mean, you have to be pretty careful, but I think as long as it's going to, in your mind, improve the outcome of the event, et cetera, it's okay to admit your mistake right then and there or in the appropriate time. You know, there may be some situations where you're thinking, no, that's not a good thing to do, because it's going to cause more problems than it's going to solve by doing that. But at least you need to admit the mistake to yourself. And at least you need to do that and say, you know what, I should have done that differently. And one of the ways that over the years, now, again, I'm a track specialist, so there's always a team at a track race, always. I mean, there is at every race, but more so at a track race because things are happening all in front of people. You know, you're all together, you're all seeing the same thing at the same time. And you know, Andy and I have worked a lot of races together. And one of the things that we always did was, you know, when we got in the car to go back to the hotel or whatever, you know, we'd be talking back and forth about, you know, whether we felt okay about what happened that day, whether we didn't, maybe what we should have done, or feeling good that we did something in a certain way. And acknowledging the fact that there might have been other options, but we made the right choice. And so, so I think having somebody, as Justin talked about, having somebody that you can talk to, whom you respect, to be able, whether it's on the spot or whether it's later, to be able to say, you know, here was the situation, here's what I did. What do you think? I mean, what would you have done in this situation? And always, always, always learning from your mistakes. So you can survive a mistake in front of very, very, very qualified elite riders and still, and other officials, and still, you know, take that next step. And I can assure you, I am a perfectly good example of that because that's only 2 mistakes. So there you go. So with that, does anybody have any, I'm not seeing any questions at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Chuck to jump in here and ask if there's anything else he would like us to discuss.
Yeah, and I think if everybody doesn't mind, you know, if you have any questions, put them in chat. It usually takes a few minutes to put them out there. Got a question for, I'm going to throw it to both Justin and Andy, and Noreen, I've got a separate one for you that's relevant. But we talked about, and I'll do my quick story, is I had I was a executive director of a nonprofit, and I had a board president at one point. And he and I sat down to do evaluation. He said, you know, who's your board? I said, well, you're my board president. And he goes, no. I'm not talking about who your board of directors is. Who's your personal board? Who do you go to for advice and questions? And I've always felt since then, it's really important to cultivate a group of peers and people who I feel can give me good advice. And I've done that in the cycling realm. Andy's one of the folks I'll call and bounce stuff off of. But for Justin and Andy, what, you know, Justin, you mentioned some names, but how do you handle that? How do you cultivate that? Justin, why don't you go first? Who do you bounce stuff off, and what's the process for that?
Yeah, so like I said, the 3 people that I use the most are Judy, who I have classified as my second mom since I got started at 16. I mean, I saw her at basically my first race up until the national championships that I'm at now as staff, and it's just been a trust. Obviously, everybody has the person who taught their first officials course, unless you went through the online course. But everybody has that first person that you work with. Everybody has the first person that you just feel comfortable with, and somebody that's willing to push you, but also be a sounding board and be able to tell you when you've screwed up or when you've also made a good decision and back you up either way. So Judy is one of those people for me. And then also Michael Donovan, who's on our National Technical Commission. and then Michael Droulet, who taught both my elite national and international course on the mountain bike side. And it's just a pot of trust. It's that ability to just open up, feel vulnerable, and say, hey, I may have made a mistake. What would you have done here? And how would you have handled this differently? And if you would have handled it the same, why? And it's always the why that you could come back to, and just having the ability to have that person or persons to go to.
Great, thanks, Justin. Andy, what's your, coming up and where you are now?
Well, coming up, it was probably Noreen, because he was obviously the person that was I was learning the most from. Let me put it that way. And I mean that, and that she was helping me become an official. But that points race that she talked about with Mike McCarthy and Leonard Harvey Nitz, I still remember that race to today. I mean, and I've told her this before, but I learned a lot from her mistakes. And I didn't have to make those mistakes to still learn from it. And I think that's something that I think each and every one of us can do, is at a race, hey, this happened. Would I do that if I was in that position? Would I not? Think about it. Just a kind of self-evaluation of it. The other person I've dealt with a lot is Randy Shafer. And Randy, when he lived here in Colorado Springs, unfortunately he's no longer here, but we would go to lunch after every one of our big races. Meaning, if Randy had a big international race or I had a big international race or whatever, we typically have a lunch after that race and just sit and chat about that race. And both of us, I think, would learn from each other's experiences. So that's how I basically have dealt with it, Chuck.
Great, thanks. And
yeah,
I'd encourage everybody to, think about who that or more experienced official and build that camaraderie with them. And it's not always mistakes. Sometimes it's just running things by. How would you handle a situation or an issue? And it's always good to get that feedback. And it's something I still do to this day. Noreen, question for you. Tomorrow, Sarah Thomas becomes the first woman to officiate a Super Bowl. And boy, you talk about a big microscope. And you went into it a little bit, but as one of the groundbreaking females as an official, do you feel like it's been more pressure on you, and how do you handle that?
I think the most interesting part of that for me was I had an opportunity to really talk with folks from the UCI about my perception of how they were handling women and assignments for women's at track events. And I think what was interesting out of that was I was very excited that they actually listened. But on top of that, I was not trying to say it should be me. What I was trying to say is women need to be assigned to some of these positions that they have not been assigned to before. And, and maybe you need to realize that this is what you're doing. And if you're not sure, go back and look, because I can tell you no woman has ever been assigned as an example, as a starter at a World Cup or a World Championship. And they went back and looked and said, ooh, you're right. And so, I was happy that I had that opportunity, but I was scared to death. And because I did not want to, my very first high profile assignment was the European Track Championships. And I was the president of the panel. You should have seen my face when I opened that email. And I looked at that and I went, oh, and I'll tell you what, it was crazy. It was not a good event for me. In fact, between that and another event, I will never go back to Appledorn again. But it was a very stressful event, and it was because I was under a microscope, and I knew that. And I knew I was under a microscope, not only personally, but as a female. And the same thing's going to happen at the Olympic Games. And yes, I'm nervous. Yes, I am nervous. And it's hard. But you know what? We now internationally, opportunities are opening up for women that have not been there before. They have always been there in this country. And I think many of us take that for granted. But on an international level, don't take it for granted because it's hard. And the people that have come before me, the women that have come before me that are international commissaires, they paved the way for me. And I hope I'm paving the way for other people. But, you know, my lesson in my self-talk is just, you know, just do the absolute best you can every single time you go out there. And you know, then they won't care whether you're a male or a female. They just want a good official. So that's how I feel about that.
No, Noreen, that's great. And, you know, tomorrow we're going to talk about bias. We've got David Lipson coming, and it's not just male, female. It's not race. It's so many things. I can tell you, you know, I've showed up at a race in Belgium, and they're like, an American, he can't know anything about bike racing. You know, I mean, we look at Belgians thinking they know everything. So, I mean, that bias is built in. I will just add on that I think things really are changing. So you all know the president of the Commissaries Commission now is a female. And I sit on that. And some of the people I respect most and that commission respects most are the very strong, experienced female commissaries on there. So I think we are seeing some good change there, but obviously have a bit of way to go. Again, throw any questions in, something besides WWND in chat.
Oh,
what would Noreen do?
Not a good idea. I do. Oh man, I forgot what I was going to say. All right, Chuck.
Yeah.
Well, Noreen, while you're thinking there, one of the other things that I actually just thought of, and it is our next topic alongside of the Hall of Fame, is obviously I'm a lot younger than our average official's age. And if any of you have been into the office and seen the Hall of Fame or know those people, you've worked with them, they've shaped you as an official. I don't know a single one of them. I think I might have actually ran into Dave Miller at one point in time at the Tour of California, but I knew none of them. And it's my group, my Hall of Fame are the people working now. Most of your Hall of Fame are the people that are up there and the three that we're going to induct today. So just because you don't know the Hall of Fame doesn't mean you're not going to be a good official. It's just you have to find your own Hall of Fame and be willing to talk to them.
Great. I've got a question in chat directly, and I'll ask the question. Is a question for Noreen. It's the Noreen show right now. But how you're going to prepare for the Olympics and how you're mentally preparing. I'll tell you a quick story. I went out to the last track World Cup we had here in the U.S. and Noreen, I think it was right before you got assigned to those races in Europe. And we're at the Carson Velodrome in California, and there's Noreen. And I'm not a track guy, so I clung to her basically to, you know, we neither of us were working on the crew, but I'm like, what are you doing here? And she said, I'm assigned to these big races in Europe. I want to do well. I'm here to watch how the officials are working and how the new rules are being interpreted. You know, we don't all that luxury. We talked about craft early and perfecting your craft. That's what it's about. So, Noreen, how are you preparing for Tokyo?
Well, COVID has been a challenge, as we all know. I have not worked any bike race, let alone a track race, since last February with the World Championships, where I was once again very honored to be the first woman president of the panel for a World Championship. So, learned a lot about that. I could tell you a lot of stories about that. But the good thing about that particular event was the fact that we had the Olympic crew there. because they expected, obviously, to have the Olympic Games in July of 2020. So we were all assigned to that particular event. So here's the good news. I know the people that I'm going to be working with, and I know what I can count on them for. They know what they can count on me for. I know the judge referee. I know how he views things now. I also am preparing myself for how I'm going to address things that decisions that he may make that I don't completely agree with, which there was one or two in the World Championships. And you gotta, as the president of the panel, you got to be out there supporting the decisions of your judge referee. So I've worked with the crew, so that's really good. I also did ask that crew be assigned to the Nations Cup in Cali, Colombia, which is the last Nations Cup before the Olympic Games. So I will be doing that as the president of the panel. And I am, the secretary's course helped get me back into a mindset, because I taught the secretary's course a mindset of, oh yeah, this is, yeah, okay. Cali's going to help, and I've got to prepare for Cali before I can prepare for the Olympics. Emotionally, I'm not sure I can prepare for it any better than what I just told you, which is reminding myself that this is another bike race. Yes, it's a big deal, but reminding myself it's another bike race, and I got here because I'm good, not because I'm a female. And that I just need to go out and do the very best I can every single day and every single hour that I walk out onto that track. And nobody can expect anything more of me than that. And nobody is harder on me than I am. So that's how I'm preparing.
Awesome. Great, Noreen. We got a couple more minutes. Zach sent a question in chat everybody can look at, but it's been a long time since many of us have officiated. I know that's the case for me. And we're hoping to have racing starting back soon. Do any of y'all have any suggestions on how to prep for the next race? I said y'all, Justin's probably laughing at that. So that means you all.
Yes, I looked over at Morgan and chuckled when you said y'all. It makes me feel at home.
So anybody have any suggestions on how to mitigate mistakes? One I'll just put out there is and I say this before every event, if it's been a while, I just go review the regulations, especially for that specific event. But anybody have any thoughts or comments?
No, I agree with you, Chuck. I think you have to do that. I don't know that I have anything specific, but definitely looking over the regs, going through in your mind what you're going to be doing, visually thinking about what you're going to do, and I think is important.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I'll just add on that, preparation, we get rusty at it. One of the most impressive feats of preparation I've seen, a lot of you know Wayne Pomerio, and from Canada, now from Australia, is I was the technical director for Worlds in Richmond, and he was president of the commissaires panel. And the documentation and prep that guy put into getting ready for that event, starting months ahead of time, I don't want to say he couldn't fail, because that's never the case, but chance favors the prepared mind. If you are ready, you're gonna minimize. And the worst mistakes I've ever had are going back to an event the second year and saying, well, I knew this last year, and just not spending that due diligence on it. And I think that's even more relevant now that we haven't been working, is just don't get that false sense of security. Tony asked a question here. Welcomes inside knowledge, possible conflict between riders and teams. Prefer to officiate what you see transpire without having prior notice. So I think what you're asking, Tony, is, does it benefit you all to know there are issues out there beforehand? Or I think this goes a little, Tony, to the bias thing we're talking about tomorrow. Just let things happen and handle them. So
yeah. I'll say at least one thing on it. Very first time I showed up to a bike race in Colorado as a resident, which was the fall of 2016. I showed up for a crit, and one of the officials came up to me and said, "Hey, just want to let you know this particular rider in the pro field has caused issues." And the last race he did in I think it was 2015 or maybe earlier in the spring, he got off his bike and started yelling at officials because he disagreed with a call. And I'm like, I don't care. I will care if I see something, then I will ask for, do you have any particular issues in the past with this one rider? But I don't want somebody to cloud my judgment before I see something happen.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that, Justin, but when you're, particularly when you're working on a national or an international level, both places, and, Justin's a relatively new official, I'm not. So I know which riders to look out for. I know which, and throughout the event, because it's, often held over 4 or 5 days, you also know which riders you need to look out for in the next race and the next race and the next race. And, but I rarely ever go into an event going, oh yeah, I've got to keep an eye on that Swiss team, or I've got to keep an eye on that. Because you're too busy looking at the race as a whole. And if you're keeping your eye on one person, you're missing the race as a whole. And I think that's a disservice to the race itself.
Yeah, I may have a little bit different take on that. I think that that knowing that there's a conflict between riders or teams, I would welcome that knowledge. I don't welcome the knowledge beyond that. Okay, but just having that information to keep an eye out for it if I need to, that's good.
Yeah, and I think reading the question now, that a conflict between riders and teams, I think that is more important, opposed to the bias that could potentially be created of, hey, look out for so-and-so because he's a problem child. I don't want to know about the problem child unless I know of it myself, but knowing that there may be issues between CCC and Katusha, or obviously Katusha's old, but knowing those particular issues would be of more importance than one rider might be the problem child.
Great. Roberta asked a question. I'll just address this, Roberta. It's with the lack of races, are we going to do any practice? That's a good idea. And again, with challenges come opportunities. And I think something we can look at with the NTC with Zoom to throw out some scenarios and other things out there. So something to look at over the course of the summer for those webinars we talked about. So I'd like to thank everybody, and you're going to see Noreen and Andy here in a minute for our next presentation. But these 3 officials have really good reputations in the community amongst riders and other commissaires, not because they've never made a mistake, but because they've handled them elegantly and with grace, and have learned from them. And I think that's what we wanted to portray today. Is it's going to happen, but it's how you learn from it, And I'll tell you, I think there's this fear that if someone calls me or the CEO at USA Cycling and complains about an official, that your career is over, and that is not the case. You may get a call saying what happened, and you may get a question of, did you learn from it? What would you have done differently? But don't think those are career enders out there. So, all right, well, let's take a very brief 2-minute break.